Hi everyone, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I feel a little bit of imposter syndrome because, to be honest, a lot of the work has been done by all the other authors on this slide, but I'm very happy to talk to you about it nonetheless. The other thing as well I was going to say is that for a variety of different reasons, my executive functions just aren't at the races these days. So I'm going to lean into cognitive rehab and I'm going to use my notes. So bear with me. It also means I get to say as much as I can in the time I have available. Okay, but let's start with this. So last Friday was World MS Day and the theme was diagnosis. And some of you may have seen the article by Naomi Donaldson that is in the Irish Times, and she talked about her experience of diagnosis with relapsing remitting MS and the adjustment process that she went through afterwards. And she and Hugh Carney, who also contributed to the article, both made the point of saying that, understanding signs and symptoms of MS is really important because early detection leads to early intervention. And I would also think that early recognition of progression is also important as well, because all of these things lead to personalised treatments and better outcome. And that's the idea behind, I suppose, doing clinical research. We want the best for people with MS so that they can live the life that they would like to live as best they can. So, the traditional view of MS identified 3 general phases of the illness course, differentiated by how apparent clinical symptoms are. So we have 3 phases here. And typically associates progressive changes in function with relapse. So what's called relapse-associated worsening, and that's this little blue line here. The boundaries between relapsing remitting and a secondary progressive MS are unclear, with no definition of progression. And the risk of progression, I suppose, simply increases in line with the length of time that a person has MS. And a recent paradigm shift proposes instead that MS clinical course might be better conceptualised as a continuum. So there may be progression from the outset, regardless of MS phenotype, with a silent or smouldering progression, even prior to formal diagnosis. And that's this line here. And this is called PURA, or progression independent of relapse activity. So even when a person is ostensibly well, they may be experiencing changes in some areas that are not readily apparent, but may be detected on more specific, more sensitive tests. And timely detection of PURA is crucial for a more effective clinical management, instead of just responding to clinically apparent relapses. And I guess whether we're looking at relapse-associated worsening or PURA, by widening our focus beyond traditional measures and incorporating measures of hidden symptoms that have been talked about earlier today, like cognition, fatigue and mental health, we're more likely to detect signs of early progression for better clinical decision-making. And as we've heard from Audrey and from a lot of different speakers today, this is prompting clinical researchers to look closely at other potential biomarkers for MS illness progression, so that we are capturing more information than what might be available to us through traditional methods. And I guess, just kind of briefly, what are biomarkers? Well, simply put, they are biological markers or measurable indicators of a biological process. And identification of MS biomarkers can help us, I guess, attain information that allows for better diagnosis, provides better clues for predicting relapse. It helps us to have more early identification of people with MS who are at risk of progression. It enables more early decision-making rather than intervention. It allows us to monitor treatment response. And they can help us prognosticate in relation to disability. So to help people with MS and their families develop, I suppose, more reasonable expectations about what the future might hold. And if we think about, I guess, what we might see in psychology clinics in terms of uncertainty and how living with MS is around living with a lot of uncertainty, the more that we can use the data available to us to offer a little bit of clarity, the more that we're able to help people manage and, I suppose, live as effectively and as well as they can. And I guess ideally, biomarkers are both specific and sensitive. So they're able to discern between individuals who have MS from those who do not have MS, and then also between people who maybe are experiencing different MS phenotypes or who are at different points in the MS continuum. The idea would be that biomarkers would be as much as possible non-invasive. So somebody mentioned lumbar punctures earlier on being quite tricky and very difficult to manage on an ongoing basis. So something that is easy to acquire within a clinical setting, that is accurate, reproducible, cost-effective. These are all kind of good properties of biomarkers, and these are things that we're holding in mind then when we're looking to see what type of metrics we might be able to add into the mix. I won't go through all of these. They've been kind of dealt with, I think, a little bit in Audrey's presentation. I guess what we're looking at, though, are a variety of different measurement challenges. So, for example, a lot of research is focusing on neuroimaging and fluid and tissue biomarkers currently, and while some have added greatly to the toolkit, I suppose there are some drawbacks for different ones. So, for example, neurofilament light chains are a fluid biomarker, but these are not specific to MS. They also occur in Alzheimer's and motor neuron disease, and they can overlap in terms of the levels with people who are participating as healthy controls in studies. Similarly, routine clinical MRI is not granular enough, and reports can indicate normally appearing white matter despite changes in function in cognition and other domains. And as Audrey has explained, commonly used clinical measures of change are largely focused on physical function. So there can be quite insensitive for measuring change in disability accrual in progressive MS in particular. So it's important to study other actionable biomarkers, particularly in progressive MS, to address the limitations of only using one or a few metrics in order to detect the nuanced changes across multiple meaningful domains of function that can impact quality of life. So essentially, MS is complex and heterogeneous, so MS looks different in different individuals. Therefore, a combination of well-selected biomarkers is what's needed, especially to better quantify change in disability in progressive MS. So, Fiona spoke to some of this earlier, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but changes in cognition are important determinants of disability. Different papers will give you different stats, but I guess broadly speaking, between 40 to 70% of people with MS will experience changes to cognition, and these will vary greatly from person to person depending on where the lesions are in the brain. And although most changes are experienced in the mild to moderate ranges, they are more prevalent in progressive MS and can be detected even in preclinical stages. Structural lesions are correlated but not fully explanatory, and cognitive dysfunction, as I said, can occur in normally appearing MRI brain scans. So cognitive assessment therefore can offer us an insight into other aspects of MS-related activity that may contribute to disability accrual over time. And indeed, and this came up earlier on as well, regular cognitive screening is recommended, though the unfortunate reality is that this is difficult to achieve in under-resourced clinics. So sometimes there are gaps in our ability to provide that service on a regular basis. However, some early research does show that measures of cognition and other factors, such as fatigue, when they're used in combination with usual measures such as the EDSS, improve accuracy of disability assessment. Studies show that MS-related changes can occur in several cognitive domains, and in particular, MS is associated with changes in processing speed, measured by the Symbol Digit Modalities Test, or SDMT. So processing speed has been shown to be a significant predictor of general MS outcomes, including employment, driving ability, and independent completion of everyday activities. Changes in processing speed are associated with disability accumulation on the EDSS measure, as well as MRI indicators of illness activity. So there's good correlation between processing speed and other markers of illness progression. And I guess we're making the case for a new potential biomarker of progression and disability in MS. And this is based on some of the work that Audrey described in her presentation. It's proposed that illness-related changes in visual object meaning perception may offer an additional route to distinguishing MS-related progression. So visual object meaning perception really essentially means the ability to find the correct word or name for an object when provided with a visual cue. So this proposed biomarker was initially, I suppose, identified by Yap and colleagues in their study, which was conducted in Vincent in 2020 and 2021. And their study aimed to evaluate word finding, prosody, and social cognition in people with MS versus healthy controls. And participants completed a very comprehensive battery of word finding, social cognition, standardized neuropsychological and clinical neurological assessments. There were several key findings, I guess, in this study. And for this presentation, an important finding was that compared to healthy controls, and that's this bit here, people with MS were significantly slower on tasks where they had to name objects on the basis of a visual clue. And within the MS group, people with progressive MS were significantly slower than those with relapsing remitting MS. So I guess what was noted was that these visually mediated word-finding tests significantly discriminated between participant groups. So there was a difference between MS and healthy controls, and then within MS between relapsing remitting and progressive MS. So if we're thinking about what a good biomarker would represent, we're beginning to see that this could be a test that could fit the bill for us. And what they found was that there was actually, quite interestingly, a bigger statistical effect on these tasks in terms of discriminating groups than on the traditionally used SDMT. So the question then is, could visually mediated naming be a potentially unique MS-related deficit and offer promise as a cognitive biomarker? And I guess this is what we are seeking to find out now in a 4-year longitudinal follow-up study. So today I'm going to present just the initial kind of sneak peek at data collected thus far, looking specifically at the MS group for now. As this is a repeated measure, they'll act as their own controls, which is quite helpful. So the follow-up commenced in 2024, and data have here that I'm going to present are derived from 11 people with progressive MS and 10 people with relapsing remitting MS who underwent reassessment with the same very comprehensive battery. Here, though, I'm going to focus on data from the EDSS, the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale, and 4 key cognitive measures. And these are the Simba Digital Modalities Test for Processing Speed, the Rapid Automatized Naming Test, and the Visual Naming Test. And both of these are visually cued naming tests. And the Auditory Naming Test, where objects are named on the basis of a verbal description. So that's kind of, I guess, our control. I just want to give a quick shout out here to Lauren Costello, who's our research assistant, and she's had a poster here today, and hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at it, and that's related to the research that we're talking about here. So, down to the brass tacks, just from a demographics point of view, this table shows that participants did not differ on key characteristics of age, years of education, or time since diagnosis, regardless of whether they were grouped by sex or MS phenotype. In terms of disability, based on EDSS ratings, participants did not differ on the basis of sex. However, the distribution of EDSS scores on follow-up did differ significantly on the basis of MS phenotype. And more about that again. Higher disability ratings were associated with poorer performance on visually, but not auditory cued naming tasks. And it was also associated with poorer information processing speed. So we're kind of hitting what we were finding in the initial paper and what we would expect based on, I suppose, our understanding of disability and processing speed correlations to date in other research. However, disability ratings did not correlate with either anxiety or depression symptom ratings. Comparing EDSS ratings over time, this graph shows that there was a clear and consistent effect of MS diagnosis with significantly higher ratings of disability for people with progressive MS, which are the light blue bars. I realise blue and green are probably not great colours for graphs, but anyway. There were no overall changes in disability ratings between baseline and follow-up, however. At follow-up, we've had ratings so far from 9 people. Initial exploratory analyses show median scores in the non-clinical range, though the spread of scores indicate at least some participants endorse clinically elevated symptoms. Repeated measures, non-parametric comparisons suggest that the level of endorsed anxiety and depression have not changed significantly over the longitudinal interval. And in this graph, we see that a 2A in ANCOVA, control for age and years of education, show that individuals with progressive MS, again the light blue bars, are consistently significantly slower than people with relapsing remitting MS on the SDMT processing speed task, but there is no overall change in processing speed over time. And this last bar chart shows a 2A ANCOVA controlling for age, years of education, and time to processing speed on scores from a visually mediated naming task. Individuals with progressive MS were consistently significantly slower than those with relapsing remitting MS, but overall, though, there was no difference in performance between between baseline and follow-up. I guess what is interesting from these two correlations is that time to reaction time performance on the visual naming task significantly correlates positively with both EDSS ratings and negatively with the information processing speed scores. And I guess these are our two traditional biomarkers. So we're kind of getting a good pattern in terms of these are kind of consistently showing change for people with progressive MS relative to relapsing remitting. So this initial look at a 4-year longitudinal data indicates that slower processing speed and performance on tasks measuring visual object meaning perception correlate with greater MS-related disability and clinical measures with greater difficulties in visually mediated object naming experienced by persons with progressive MS. And the findings follow the same pattern as those of Yap and colleagues and in other studies as well, suggesting stability of this finding over time. So we have to wonder, though, why there are no significant changes in performance over time. So malpractice effects, for example, have obscured potential findings. I mean, other factors that have been mentioned earlier as well is when we consider some of the other kind of variables that might be important, might be DMT adherence and efficacy, well-being factors, and things like then cognitive reserve as well, and whether there are attributes of a highly educated population or group of under study that may be enabling people to preserve a level of function over a 4-year time period. So, where are we at this point? Well, we're only beginning to explore a very large time 2 data set, and we're also collating data from healthy controls. We have a lot to think about in terms of variables, including questionnaire data that might unlock further information about the predictive value of hidden symptoms such as fatigue and well-being factors. And certainly, we do seem to have something in visually mediated object naming that discriminates between people with progressive and relapsing remitting MS. Considering a continuum approach and expanding on the outcome of further analyses, it may be worth validating the VNT for an Irish MS population as a measure to use routinely in clinic, alongside the measures that go with the BICAMs. I'm hoping it won't look too much like this, but it might look like that a little bit. However, the main thing is that we are working towards early detection, whether that's at a diagnostic from a diagnostic perspective or in terms of early recognition of progression, always with the view of trying to personalise treatment for better outcomes. And another shout out to Hannah Lynn. She's also here presenting a poster today, and she's looking at social cognition and psychological markers of well-being over the 4-year follow-up as well to see what comes out of that data. This is drawn from our large data set as well. So again, thank you very much to the participants. There's a lot that we've asked from them, and they've been very gracious, to all of the collaborators, and that's my contact information if you want to get in touch. So I think I'm probably well over time now at this stage. So thank you.